welcome back to Triple Scorpio. I'm Izzy, and I feel like it's been so long since I sat down and recorded one of these podcasts, but I truly have been on a 2-month long hero's journey. It was family related, work related. I think I've been on 8 different plane rides, just truly been so crazy. Gone through a few different moon cycles that we're definitely going to get into here on this episode today, but I feel like this is going to be a little bit more stream of consciousness than my previous episodes. There have been so many topics around astrology that have come up in my readings over the past 2 months, and just general thoughts that I've been trying to consolidate. I actually tried to record this episode yesterday with very little preparation, just my stream of consciousness notes in my notes app, and it did not go well, but I'm chalking it up to learning experience, and shout out Sam for suggesting to write everything down in a cohesive way before I hopped on the pod. So yeah, I'm back. I really was inspired to talk about the different moon cycles today because on these said hero's journeys, I have been predominantly tracking the sign and the phases of the moon. I think that's also greatly influenced by the fact that I'm reading a Demetra George book about the moon, which I can share in the show notes. I think if you are tapped into this podcast, it's probable that you are tapped into other online astrology spheres. So you might be familiar with, these sort of week ahead transits, today, daily transits sort of content that's constantly being put out. And I think this episode is going to be my manifesto on those things and how I interact with transits and sort of what I think is super important to look at when we're tracking different cycles of life. Okay, so all of the hero's journeys that I've been on have basically been revolving around like the new moon and full moon cycles over the past 2 months. It started during the Aries new moon on April 17th. Then it culminated on May 1st with the Scorpio Taurus full moon, and then kind of started to close out during the Taurus new moon, and then culminated again on the Sagittarius full moon. Very brief description of how those things were impacting my chart. I have a Leo rising, which means that the angular houses, the very impactful areas of my chart, are all in fixed signs. So when there is activity in the sky in fixed signs, things impact me very literally and very intensely. And the new moon in Aries, I was in a foreign country during that time, and that's in my 9th house of foreign travel. And it was right around when I published this podcast. And the 9th house also rules over publishing. And then the full moon culminated in my 10th and 4th house, which was right around a time that I was feeling just like really intensely in my relationship and was thinking a lot about family dynamics, my family past, my connection to my family, and sort of like that of my partner, my fiance. And it was also just like the end of this really amazing trip that I had with my brother-in-law to be. And there were just like really high strung, like intense emotions around those themes. And my emotions came out very publicly, which is very common with a full moon with the 4th and 10th house. Like you can just kind of have these very like public and vulnerable displays of emotions because that 10th house is the most public part of your chart and the 4th house is the most private. So it's very much about like the private becoming public. And that definitely came up on that day. And then during that cycle, from that like 10th house, 4th house full moon all the way to the 10th house new moon for me, I'm saying that the houses that the moon was hitting in my personal chart, that Taurus new moon on May 16th was opposing all of my Scorpio in the 4th house of family, ancestry, home, memories, nostalgia, all of these things. And it was the culmination of the wrapping up of moving my grandmother out of her house of 40 years which was the only house that I've like consistently had in my life. So there was a lot embedded in that, and so many things around, yeah, like our family history, our stories, our connection to the past, all of that stuff was coming up. So that was opposing all of those very intense aspects in my chart. Plus, it was the beginning of a new cycle for my grandma, of like a new life that she was starting out with in her new house. And Taurus is actually in her fourth house of home and family. So this new beginning of a new moon in her fourth house of home. It's always really fun to like look at your family's charts at the same time while you're experiencing certain transits to see how they sort of compare to what you're going through. For example, while I was going through this moon cycle, that was very much impacting my fourth house of like home and family, and my grandmother's fourth house of home and family. My fiance, Sam, who was with us, it was hitting his eighth house of other people's stuff. So he was dealing with, all of this like other people's trauma and things, and, intense things that need to be dug up from the surface. All like that moon cycle was impacting this axis of like death and inheritance and other people's stuff, and like his personal foundation and sort of what he values. So that was very much at the top of his mind, and at the top of my grandma in my mind was very much like, whoa, our past is really coming up. Like all of these family stories, all of these things that we keep buried are now becoming very public and dislodging all these energies in this move. Fourth house, 10th house transits tend to have to do with, moving of homes. So yeah, that's sort of like the backstory. And the last thing I'll add when I mentioned with like the Sagittarius full moon was that like once I got home, after that Taurus new moon, I then was preparing to go on another trip in like a foreign place, which is very Sagittarius. But now I'm finally back. The energy is dissipating. We are slowing down. We're moving with the cycles of the moon. So basically like these sort of like fluctuations and inflections at points of action that have been happening over the past 2 months, I have very much been tracking the moon for that. I would be super curious to hear if these full moon and new moon cycles have been really strong and impactful for you guys, if you guys have been paying attention to any of that. But yeah, definitely let me know how that's been showing up for you guys. Basically, what it's been making me think about is some very basic concepts that we might take for granted. Basically, like with all of these journeys and like literal voyages to foreign places and coming back home and thinking about the wisdom that was gained on these, trips and explorations that I've been on. I've been like really thinking a lot, and I want to explore the concept here of just like this like hero's journey, right? And it's very on par with, like I said, the Sagittarius full moon that we're coming off of. Life really is a series of cycles, and astrology does a really good job at sort of like giving structure to that. The birth chart in many ways is like a map of our own hero's journey that we will continue to go on over and over again from different perspectives. Sagittarius as an archetype really likes to go out in the world and explore, and I'm sure a lot of us have been feeling this sort of like desire to seek out new wisdom, desire to go out and explore and to leave the local. And it really calls to mind a quote from The Artist's Way, which is something I just finished The Artist's Way, which is also a 12-week thing, very similar to the 12 signs and the 12 houses in astrology. And I was making all of these connections when I was wrapping it up. But I was thinking about this quote from the epilogue of The Artist's Way, where she says, "What I conjure now is a mountain of Himalayan proportions with a path winding upward to its height. That path, a spiral path, is how I think of the artist's way. As we pursue climbing it, we circle back on the same views over and over at slightly different altitudes. I've been here before, we think, hitting a spell of doubt. And, in a sense, we have been. The road is never straight. Growth is a spiral process, doubling back on itself, reassessing and regrouping." And when I read this, I was like, cool, this is a perfect example of how we go through the cycles of the moon, which I'm going to talk more in depth about in terms of transits. It's something that's very embedded in our human consciousness on a cellular level. If life is a series of cycles, then tracking the cycles of the planets, the sun, and the moon really helps give the sort of like macro structure of our lives these more micro touchstones, if that makes sense. This sort of visual of the spiraling back and, reassessing and feeling like we've been in these places before, it's something I really like to think about in terms of the birth chart. One of my teachers, A.T. Mann, who I talk about a lot, actually sees the birth chart as this spiral of creation, starting at our conception. So even before our ascendant point, which is the point of our birth, he goes all the way back to the point of conception and takes us through. You go through the entire spiral from the cusp of the ninth house, which comes after the death of the eighth house, which is the point of your conception in his practice of astrology. And you go all the way through back to that eighth house and see sort of how we interact with our own creativity, what we bring into the world, and sort of what roadblocks and what things come up for us as we're going through that creation process. So if life is a series of cycles, like I said, but also just this series of creation and like culmination and dissipation and going back and reassessing and trying to build upon what we've learned before, looking at the birth chart in this way can really give us a helpful structure to, understand the cycles and the transits as they come up. We may experience a hero's journey each month, each year, with each planetary cycle many times over, but we've changed and are different at every time that cycle repeats. And ideally, we're building on the things that we've learned from the previous one. So this returning back to a point that we've come to before, it's not that we're regressing, it's that we are building upon and understanding where we've come from. So the sort of just like, without understanding history, it'll repeat itself concept, which is also very Cancerian, which is where Jupiter, the planet of our wisdom, is right now. So this desire to understand our past and like the paths that we've come from, the path that brought us here, can give us a lot of wisdom. And I think this sort of cyclical nature and the cycles of things can allow us to continue on and gain the wisdom of these heroes' journeys. So as I was mentioning, my teacher actually looks at the birth chart and understands the sort of conception point as the beginning of our creative cycle as well. So it starts at the cusp of the ninth house. So he teaches that the wheel of our chart is not only the wheel and story of our conception and our life, but also the cycles of our own drives, motivations, and process through which we create and manifest things in our lifetime. So that conception point, or that like beginning spark of the idea, is the cusp of the ninth house, which is this leap into the unknown after the decay and the death and the shedding of the skin that happens in the eighth house. The ninth house is very much associated with this pursuit of knowledge and God, higher learning, exploration, and sort of like the wisdom that we gain through action. And this is also associated with Sagittarius. This ninth house energy of exploration and like leap of faith and leap into the unknown, it can be very insatiable and restless. It's this wandering spirit archetype. And that ninth house is associated with the sign of Sagittarius, and it's the sign that we just had our full moon in. And the Gemini and Sagittarius axis has a lot to do with our minds, how we think, and also the environments that we gain that information in. So Gemini is very quick, it's very curious, it's very, wanting to gain information on many different topics. It can be difficult to hold its attention, but typically Gemini also represents an environment that is local. It's an environment that is very familiar to us. It's like our sort of daily neighborhood and all of the information that's exchanged in like this sort of daily marketplace of ideas, It's the information that's given, with your voice. It's the information that's given like between friends and siblings and like, friends and friends that feel like siblings that can teach us so many things. It's our early education. It's sort of like where we learn to speak and to mimic other people. It's a much more localized place where we learn. That's also because it's associated with a very early stage of our lives. It's like associated, like I said, with that phase of where we're learning to speak and the sort of like time in our lives where we have to learn a little bit about everything to sort of get acclimated and start to go out into the world, right? And Sagittarius is the opposite of that and the sister sign of that. So Sagittarius is the knowledge that we gain when we go out into the world and we leave our environment that's very familiar to us. It's where we go and explore the unknown. It's where, it's information that maybe we learn from a published book or somebody who's a master at something that's teaching us by showing us how they did it. It's very action oriented. It's very exploratory. It is insatiable and curious in the same way that Gemini is, but it wants to go super deep into something so that it can immerse itself. And it's a fire sign. So it's going to be very much about doing. And it's this environment of higher learning. It's the knowledge that you gain after you've been through incredible hardship. And it's very much about like teaching and sharing that wisdom and your ability to guide others. A lot of the time, Sagittarius as an archetype can also be moving so quickly that and understand concepts very quickly that they don't always take the time to soak it in and live it because they're so interested in accumulating and expanding on the next thing. So when we're thinking about all the Sagittarius energy, sometimes we might like get ahead of ourselves a little bit and try to absorb and take on and convey so much, which I really have been feeling with trying to record this episode, so bear with me. Sagittarius relates so much, and the ninth house relates so much to spirituality and God, but you might find that a lot of Sagittarius placements actually have had many moments in their lives of disillusionment of faith and sort of wanting to get to, like I always talk about with the ninth house in Sagittarius, this big T truth of just like what actually is true. And in all of us, we have, like humanity in general has this desire to find out the meaning of life and why we're all here. And typically we look to these things that can't be quantified, things that we need to have faith in and that we have to have a belief in order to, even feel like they make sense, because we can't always get to the bottom of something. There are so many things that when you go deeper and deeper into them in a very Sagittarian way, you get to the bottom of it and you're like, this can't be explained. And I need to find meaning in that. And I think, you'll find with people with a lot of Sagittarius placements, maybe there is a sort of like faith or spirituality around them that they got really turned off of. And then they went on their own hero's journey and explored many different routes to their own personal spirituality. You will start to explore something, and the deeper and deeper that you go into it, you will realize that the only explanation for this is some higher power or something that requires faith and trust. And there are so many examples of that within astrology and this archetypal language. The sun's movement and the seasons relate to our year, and the moon's cycles relate to our months. So it's like the moons, many people call it. Both are this, spiraling cyclical thing that we, like I said, are very in tune with. These delineations of time help us understand these microcycles within the macro cycle of our lives. So something that's been coming up a lot in my readings over the past 2 months have been discussing how I interact with transits and how I track these cycles, and what I like to focus on in general when I'm looking at my own transits. When I am looking at my own transits, I focus a lot on the moon and what sign it's in, what connections it's making to other planets, and how that moon is aspecting my chart. And I do this because the moon is the closest celestial body to us on Earth. Yeah, I think the more that you get comfortable with all of this, I think you'll notice the moon's impact is pretty great. The phases of the moon impact us all very personally. The moon is a very personal planet. It has so much to do with our inner emotions and our private life that are in constant flux. The phrase that like feelings are not facts, feelings are fleeting. That's very reminiscent of the cycles and the waxing and waning of the moon. For example, like the new moon phase is like the start of something, it's the budding, it's the beginning of something new. The waxing moon builds energy, and the full moon shows us the culmination of that energy. As the moon wanes, we start to feel the energy dissipate and subsiding. Our emotions start to calm down a little bit. And the dark phase, the closing phase, the phase associated most with like the death and decay, that brings us inwards and prepares us for something new. And again, this is very reminiscent of like the movement of the houses through the birth chart. The dark phase of the moon, the phase right before the new moon, is a time of gestation and closing. It's a time where we go inward and enter into the darkness in order for new ideas to start taking shape, to start taking root. And I always think of this phrase that I use very often with the 2nd and 8th house and the Taurus and Scorpio axis, which is like, there are no flowers in the spring without the gestation of seeds in the dark, underground, in the dirt. You actually can see that energy across all 3 water sign houses and water signs in general throughout the chart. All of them have this sort of, emotional gestation, a kind of like darkness to them, and sort of privacy that gives birth to new creative ideas. Think, for example, and I'll go into this on another episode because I want to talk about Jupiter moving from Cancer into Leo, but when we think about Cancer and its connection to the moon and its connection to motherhood and this like nurturing environment, but it's also associated with very private and internal experience, that sort of time of going inward allows the ideas and the creativity to flourish in Leo because it had that time of gestation and germination. So then I want to talk about, just briefly while we're talking about these transits, the connection between the planetary aspects and the phases of the moon. So the new moon, I associate it with the aspect of conjunction. It's when the sun's energy and the moon energy are the most merged. It's when the new idea of like consciousness of the sun goes inward and like takes its time to come to light. So the first quarter I associate with the square aspect. It's an active point where we start to see our creation take shape, but it requires something to happen. It requires us to do something about it. A push or an agitation is initiated, similar to a square, like I said. The full moon is when we can fully see something and understand this culmination point, like I said. We can see it very clearly in the sky. It's very illuminated. And that's when our emotions are heightened because the moon is so visible, this thing that tends to be very private and, not so exposed becomes very vulnerable because of its visibility in the sky. Then comes the third quarter moon, which again is a square aspect. We start to accept what's been illuminated and begin our course correction. So in typical square fashion, this is a sort of like redirection of energy and a dissipating and acceptance of what was seen and exposed during that full moon. Then comes the dark moon phase, or the balsamic moon phase, when it's like this real decay of something as it prepares to go back into the darkness. So it's that decay and dissipation of the moon's light, and we begin to retreat inward and start to gestate new ideas. The reason I want to go so in depth about this symbolism is because the moon, its duality, its phases, like its impact on us are expressed many times over in astrology. And to me, like I said before, it tends to be the most impactful when looking at sort of like daily, weekly experiences. So like any astrologer and like all of us who are interested in this topic, I of course track the cycles of the other planets, but sort of I'm not really big on tracking them day by day in my own life. I'd rather kind of just live my life and let it wash over me and not be so bogged down in these details of, if Venus is aspecting Uranus. It's something that, could bring something up, but I'd rather look at that in retrospect than have this sort of, log of what I'm expecting to happen and, maybe living in fear around that. Like the minutia of those transits can be helpful, I think, in retrospect, but like getting bogged down in those details can like convolute the larger arc of that cycle for us. That's why it's so helpful to really familiarize yourself with these archetypes and these cycles so that you can, instead of listening to someone being like, oh, this transit's going to bring up X, Y, and Z, you can have a better handle of like, okay, I know that this archetype means this, but it could present itself in another way. Sometimes, like I said, it makes more sense to look at them retrospectively and be like, this came up for me. How can I look at this framework and see how that was being reflected back to me? I also think tracking the moon calls to mind just sort of how our bodies relate to light or lack thereof. Before electricity was a thing, the time that the moon wasn't illuminated in the sky at night was like a time of internal retreat and more introspection. And then when the moon was full and illuminating the night, there was like the ability for there to be way more activity in the nighttime because you could see things. I also feel like this speaks to why eclipse seasons can feel so impactful. And like when we look through eclipse periods in history or people that are born during eclipses, why their lives tend to be more intense than others or tend to represent very intense inflection points in history. I really think this relates to this sort of like changing of the light in the sky. Like when the moon eclipses the sun, it completely changes our like circadian rhythms and it sort of creates this heightened energy. Our bodies are super attuned to the cycles of the sun and the moon, and eclipses like really disrupt that. So that's actually why I tend to focus a lot on the nodes and the nodal placements in a birth chart or in a year ahead reading, because they will show us where there will be a lot of heightened activity during those periods of the year and sort of show us the framework of this push and pull energy that we contain within us in our birth chart. Basically, the birth chart wheel can be looked at as a roundtable discussion, and all of the planets are discussing your north and south node. It's a framework of the sort of like polar energies that you possess within you that will be a push and pull where you're going to seek out finding balance between these two energies throughout your life. And the house placement of those is really important. I would recommend checking out if the Placidus placement of your north and south node resonates with you more than your whole sign placement, because sometimes that can change. But if you're curious to know more about your north and south node placements, definitely reach out. I'm happy to give you kind of a rundown on this, balancing these two opposing energies, because the north node and the south node are always 180 degrees apart from each other, so they're going to always be in opposite signs. It's also a beautiful example of another thing I love about astrology that I have mentioned on this podcast before, which is the opposite is the antidote, and the north and south node are begging us to listen to that, because we really want to balance the energies between the north and south node. It's not necessarily about leaning more heavily onto one or the other, but it's understanding that like when I'm too much in my south node, the antidote to that is the energy of my north node. And that's this, like I said, this push and pull framework that you tend to experience a lot throughout your life. And honestly, when I bring up the north and south node during birth chart readings, that's when things really start to click for people. Just to give just like a brief astronomical rundown of what the north and south nodes of the moon even are. They're the point where the moon crosses over the ecliptic, and the ecliptic is the apparent path of the sun. So the moon's path is tilted and it doesn't always cross over that ecliptic, but when it does, that's where the eclipses happen. And the reason why the north and south node points change sign is because of the gravitational pull of the sun on the moon, and it kind of just like drags these points backwards through the zodiac. I would also want to add in here, when we're talking about the nodes of the moon, which is where the eclipses happen each year, I would get really familiar with the modality of your rising sign in particular, and then the modality of the nodes in your birth chart. So the reason why I'm saying to get familiar of the modality of your rising sign is because when the transiting north and south node are in that same modality, they will likely impact very, important parts of your life. So it'll be impacting what's called the angular houses of your chart. And the angular houses are these very, all-encompassing areas of your chart. So the angular houses are your first house, your fourth house, your seventh house, and your 10th house. And the first house is our identities. The fourth house is our family, our history, our emotions, our private life. The seventh house is our relationships and our partnerships. And the 10th house are our larger goals and our public life. So when the eclipses are happening in the same modality as your rising sign, because those houses square each other, they will also impact the other angular houses. So for example, if you're a Virgo rising, your first house is Virgo, your fourth house is Sagittarius, your seventh house is Pisces, and your 10th house is Gemini. All of those signs are of the mutable modality. So because they're all of the same modality, when the eclipses are also in that modality, those big areas of your life will be super impacted. So for example, with that Virgo rising chart, you guys would have just experienced over the past 18 months the eclipses happening on your first and seventh house axis. They oppose each other. So the first house would have the south node in Virgo transiting it, and then the seventh house would have the north node and Pisces transiting it. And because those two houses square the fourth house and the 10th house, it's also possible that that area of your life was also impacted. So if the first house is about identity and the seventh house is about partnership, the eclipses would have likely been, impacting who do I see myself as? What sort of identity shifts are happening for me, and how are they being reflected to me through my relationships? Typically, that sort of transit might also impact the direction of our lives, the goals that we carry, and also where, the stories and our memories and our relationship to our family might also be impacted. The reason why I'm focusing so much on the moon and the nodes is because this is really what I focus on when I look at the year ahead. Of course, I'll look at the main transits that are coming up, but typically, like I said, eclipse season each year is going to bring up like big inflection points and tend to bring up big turning points. As far as predictive astrology goes, I like to look at the big transits and the eclipses sort of to give me more of a framework for the themes that the years will bring up, instead of going into the minutia of like day by day what transits will be happening. This has proven to be way more helpful for me because, again, I prefer to live my life and let it like wash over me instead of using this tool to try to predict every potential outcome that could happen on any given day in any given year. You kind of get into the chicken or the egg of it all. It's like, did it happen because it was always going to happen, or because somebody or something or some transit planted it in my mind that it would happen? And that really calls into question like this concept of fate, If this hasn't become abundantly clear already in this podcast or my other podcast, I have a lot of controlling and like obsessive mental loops. So this sort of trying to predict exact dates and events is really not helpful for me. I really like to just live my life, and when things come up, I use astrology to contextualize them and help me sort of understand a larger theme or a larger cycle that these challenges or exciting turning points might be bringing up for me. Yeah, I guess I just believe that the planets are always mirroring the inevitable, and I also believe that we're right on time. In my, recovery from obsessive compulsive disorder, on this recovery path, I really need to work hard to not try to have these controlling tendencies and to use this tool in a controlling way. Life is way more fulfilling when I'm living it and not trying to prepare for the other shoe to drop or to avoid pain or conflict. So that's how I view transits. I try not to do the super predictive style because it just hasn't necessarily been helpful for me, trying to carry this illusion of control. I'm working on having a more Buddhist mindset around these things. And I do find astrology to be helpful to make sense of things and to kind of like create a framework and to help me understand that I am right on time and that this is part of a larger cycle of my life and that I am in the driver's seat of how I experience any challenge or exciting thing that comes up in my life. And so that brings me to the next topic. All of that is a huge reason why I would categorize myself more as a modern astrologer than a traditional or Hellenistic astrologer. Clearly, as like an everything Scorpio, and with a third, fourth house stellium, which is the house of just like, people's stories, storytelling, memory, nostalgia, our past. I'm super interested in, people's stories and their psychology. I do have, I'm pretty critical of the practice of psychology in general, but that's sort of like a different conversation. But actually, funnily enough, when Saturn first dipped into Aries last year, I was considering going to grad school to become a licensed therapist and social worker, but I decided to stay on the astrology course mainly because astrology and like studying this has helped me a lot more than other modalities. And I knew that in going into becoming a licensed therapist, I wanted to pursue a more astrological bent to it. And I just decided, why not just stick on this path that I'm already on. My desire to go down the path of, potentially becoming a licensed therapist was actually very much inspired by how much I'm, interested in the work of Carl Jung, which is one of the two forefathers of modern psychology. Just because I decided not to pursue psychology doesn't mean I'm like knocking it as a profession. Obviously, I use it in like my astrology practice. But like I said, I was really taken by the work of Carl Jung. And I know it's like pretty cringe to say, but in this, pursuit of astrology, I definitely have like found my affinity more with Jungian approach to astrology. Carl Jung himself was saying that he was famously quoted as saying like, "Thank God I'm young and not Jungian." Honestly, full disclosure, like at this current juncture in time, I am definitely leaning way more on the Jungian end of the spectrum than anything else. Similarly, again, to psychology, there are so many different types of psychology and so many different types of astrology. Traditional astrology and Hellenistic astrology are more rooted in how the ancients practiced astrology. And even though Ptolemy, shout out Silent P, Ptolemy, he did popularize this like individual horoscope back in the 2nd century CE. And this would look at the fate of individuals. Back then, astrology was mainly used to track natural disasters, war, agricultural cycles, which is now linked to the practice of mundane astrology today, which tracks larger swaths of time concerning political movements, revolutions, cultural trends, etc., etc. Those tend to relate to the cycles of the outer planets. They tend to impact us on a larger scale because of their distance from the sun, and they take a much longer time to orbit the sun. In essence, traditional astrology tends to feel very deterministic, and, it can I feel like it's the origin of why people would associate astrology with feeling very like trapped and stuck in like a certain quote unquote fate without the chance to grow or evolve past these challenges that we're allegedly born with. But as I'm sure most of us know, that's not really how life works. But it actually wasn't until the late 1960s that it became more common to relate astrology with an individual's psyche. And that was heavily influenced by Carl Jung's work and his psychological analysis of the self and the collective unconscious. So he heavily used astrology in his work and interacted a lot with these ancient archetypes. So his work was not only influenced by astrology, but also his work later influenced astrology. And to use a quote from Carl Jung, he said, "I must say that I very often found that the astrological data elucidated certain points which I otherwise would not have been able to understand." So this is just him kind of talking about how looking to an astrological chart illuminated things that were maybe inaccessible just through typical psychological and therapeutic observations. Honestly, I will definitely go way more in depth with the parallels between the birth chart and Jung's concept of the self, because it's a really interesting topic to explore, and it's something that would take a really long time, and I'm already an hour into recording this, but it is on my list. I think it would be a really fun thing to talk about on here. But all of this is to say that astrology was basically my gateway into all of these psychological concepts. So I know this has been a pretty winding episode, and I still am not feeling like I've articulated myself well, hashtag sincere post. And I'm just trying to tackle a lot of really big topics that have been coming up over the past 2 weeks. And I hope that the through line is clear here and I'm not sounding too redundant. But all of these topics, when we're talking about the hero's journeys, when we're talking about Sagittarius, when we're talking about psychology and trying to understand our minds and how they work and how we're connected to something larger than us. I also saw Backrooms last night, which is pretty linked to all of these concepts. It really brings up this sort of idea that consciousness is something that we know exists, but we don't really know how or why it works or what it even is. It's something that we've really only barely scratched the surface of. And I just want to bring up, to quote Dr. Tara, who I love, just because we don't have a label for something doesn't mean that it doesn't exist or that it's not happening. There was a time where we didn't know what gravity was. I bring up this concept of consciousness as something that we're just scratching the surface of because I feel like astrology is a tool that we can use to sort of start to connect our microcosm to the macrocosm and help us understand how we are connected to something bigger than us. Astrology is one of the many ways that we can start to bridge the gap between the interior and the exterior world and to sort of start to make sense of these unknown relationships. And yeah, on that note, I very much appreciate you going down this winding road with me. I hope that some of this is making sense. I am definitely feeling just very out of practice with talking to myself and kind of just feeling a bit rusty. So thank you for bearing with me. And yeah, I very much appreciate you hanging out with me, and comment below anything that, you have questions about, or reach out to me on Substack or book a reading with me. If this was interesting to you, please share with a friend and spread the word. And I will talk to you soon. Thanks.